If you have a true scary story, consider sending it my way. Just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. Hey Raven, you asked for hospital stories, and I just so happened to have a story about something terrifying that happened while I was a nurse a long time ago. I retired from that job several years ago, but this story has always stuck with me. Probably because it was the most, I guess, exciting thing to happen while I worked there. I worked in the units where we had longer-term patients. Ones that needed to be there for a few days to weeks, depending on what was really wrong with them. And among my charges was a man named Daniel. Daniel had a pretty bad case of pneumonia that had nearly taken him out. Like, completely taken him out, if you get me. He was a fighter, though, and he was on a good track in his recovery. He was a pretty quiet guy when he was finally able to start talking again, which I didn't blame him for. I don't think I would want to talk either if I'd almost died from pneumonia. On the third or so day of his stay, things took a pretty sharp turn into the unimaginable, and it wasn't even because of his infection. I was making my rounds, checking on my patients and making sure everyone was feeling better. I got to Daniel and was checking on a few things, mostly his oxygen levels, making sure he was getting his meds and so on. When the door got shoved open hard enough for it to hit the wall, and this woman burst into the room like a storm. She was breathless, like she had been running, and her eyes looked wild. I tried to come between her and Daniel, and I asked her if she was his wife. She replied with, "No, I'm his girlfriend. Or at least I was until about an hour ago." Which was a weird way to phrase it, but I looked over at Daniel and I could see the fear on his face. I could tell that there was some major tension there, and I made an attempt to say something to her, but she cut me off and started yelling at Daniel. The whole time, his eyes wide and his heart rate spiking. She explained, very loudly, that she had gone to Daniel's house to surprise him, only to be met at the door by his wife. The confrontation that they had apparently unearthed a sordid affair, and both women were now aware of the other. I again tried to step in and calm her down, trying to tell her that this was a conversation best had when he wasn't fighting pneumonia in a hospital bed. But I was basically just background noise at that point. Her eyes were locked on him, and his eyes were looking around for an exit. She started screaming more about how he had lied to her, and how she loved him. And I, in turn, grabbed the phone to call security. I had this gut feeling that it was going to get worse, that his already strained body was going to shut down, and he would end up coding or something. And that's when she pulled out a knife from her bag. The world seemed to slow down as she lunged for Daniel. There was nothing I was able to do to stop her at this point, as I was several steps away, at the phone on the wall, and she was moving at the speed of a woman scorned. I started screaming for help, yelling that we needed someone in the room immediately, hoping that someone would notice all the commotion and figure out that something was wrong. And I watched as she plunged the knife straight into Daniel. Thankfully, though, he was cognizant enough to turn, so the knife only went straight into his arm. If he had been any weaker, there was a high chance that she would have stabbed him straight in the chest. The next few seconds were loud and confusing. Several other nurses ran into the room, and together we were able to subdue her until security arrived and cuffed her for the police. The relief of this argument not ending in tragedy was palpable, but so was the shock. In my years at the hospital, I had seen the toll illness could take on people, and their relationships. but I've never had anything play out like that right in front of my eyes. Thankfully, Daniel was already in the right place to be treated for the new hole in his arm. It was pretty bad, but nothing fatal, and nothing that wouldn't heal over time. Obviously, I think the mental scars were much worse for the guy. Yes, cheating is reprehensible, but so is stabbing someone in a hospital bed while they're a few days back from the verge of death. The police did show up and take the girlfriend away, and it was really awkward when his wife arrived later. Thankfully, she was a bit more level-headed, though I'd be lying if I didn't mention the fact that we all watched her like a hawk to make sure nothing more happened. She was pretty devastated that he could do that to her, but she didn't bring anything sharp into the room. We made sure of that. Daniel did get better physically, but I can only imagine how messed up he was mentally. Like I said, gross that he had an affair, but damn did I feel bad for him. Going from being unable to breathe to having a psychotic girlfriend run in the room and shove a knife in his arm in 3 days is quite the feat. I have no idea what happened in his marriage. I just hope that nothing else happens to him after he left our care. Hey Raven, I wanted to share a story from when I started working at this first hospital since getting my RN license. I was delegated to an elderly gentleman, Roger, that had been in a coma for a few months. He'd been ill. His wife described him as just feeling like he had a cold. This was back in 2012, by the way. And then he was rushed to the hospital as he had a stroke, putting him in a coma. Roger had several underlying conditions, and after a previous serious health issue, he and his wife had both agreed to sign DNR forms in case anything else would happen. After he went into the coma, his wife understood the chances of him waking up, but wanted to give it some time just in case. I had met Roger when he came in for the stroke. He obviously didn't speak, but I saw him conscious and was helping where I could. The following months were pretty routine. We checked his vitals, moved him to prevent sores, cleaned him, everything we would normally do for our coma patients. Sometimes his wife Sharon was there, or a couple others that I learned were Roger's siblings. Roger was stable, but that was it. He wasn't showing any signs of improving, or coming out of the coma. So the mood of the room would shift from being optimistic, talking to Roger like he was there, to being more melancholy at times. And it was understandable. You have to remain realistic in those moments, because giving someone too much hope could have negative effects. It can be hard, and it definitely was harder in the beginning, but it does get easier. Anyways, to move on to the reason for this story. I was doing my rounds when I came across Roger's room. I went in and started my checklist of things to do. While I was writing numbers down and checking his vitals, I heard a quiet, raspy voice. Nurse? Other than Roger, I was the only one in the room, so I wasn't expecting anyone in there. It made me jump a bit, but I turned to look for the source, and to my surprise, I saw Roger with his eyes open, looking straight at me. I composed myself and smiled and asked how he was feeling and how long he had been awake. He gave simple answers, smiling, saying that he heard me come in and that's when he woke up. He said he felt tired and we had a small conversation as I physically checked him out. While we spoke, I called for assistance, telling a nurse to get the doctor since he was awake. Shortly after I called for them, I tried to ask him something else, but he held his hand up, as if to stop me, and opened his mouth to speak. I don't have long. Just tell Cassie to go with the pink one, please. I know that's what she really wants, and I want her to be happy. I was confused as I hadn't met anyone that visited by the name of Cassie. I was also confused by his statement. He was in a coma, but he was now awake and seemed fine. Or as fine as you could be from waking up from a 2-month coma. But before I could question him, his eyes fluttered until they closed, and he flatlined. I called for help again, coding what was happening, but when the head nurse came in, due to the DNR request, we couldn't do much. We had to call the time of death and start the process of calling his wife and the works. His wife had just left maybe an hour or so before I was in there, as she told the nurse at the station that she was going to go home to shower and get some more clothes. She often stayed the night 2 or 3 times a week. Shortly after, Sharon, Roger's sister Barb, and a younger girl showed up in tears. Sharon seemed a bit more controlled. I think she was expecting the inevitable, which seemed to make it easier on her. We hadn't even moved Roger out yet, so they said their goodbyes there as we all finished in the room. Some people handle it better than others, but by the time the guys came in to collect Roger, they were all in better spirits, seeming to tell stories about Roger. We told them they could leave the room while they collected him, but they said they were okay with it. And that's when I heard Barb say the name Cassie, as she talked to the younger woman. It made me think about what Roger had said to me. I shouldn't have been eavesdropping, but as they talked and I thought about it more, it dug at me that I needed to tell them. I was always told about how being a nurse could be a fine line. Some people liked the nurses being involved and being personable, while others preferred that we just did our jobs and left. And being that this was the first hospital I worked at, I didn't want to mess up and get a warning, or even fired. But I knew from their conversation that they were pretty spiritual people, and laughed about Roger watching them and made a joke to Cassie about him teasing her for it. So, I felt my chances of them accepting what I said was pretty good, so I went for it. I turned and apologized for interrupting, but I asked to confirm if the younger woman was Cassie, and they confirmed, saying she was Roger's niece, Barb's daughter. Roger and Sharon didn't have any kids, but he spoiled Cassie like she was his own. So I told them that right before he passed, he woke up, and that he told me something. As I explained this, Barb and Sharon looked surprised while Cassie's eyes filled with tears, smiling. She explained that she announced that she was engaged shortly before Roger had his stroke, and her own father wasn't in the picture, so he was going to walk her down the aisle. He even agreed to pay for some of the wedding, but she had been dress shopping and was torn. Her mom wanted her to get a traditional white dress while she wanted a pink dress, and couldn't decide. They all claim they never spoke about the conundrum while at the hospital, however, so they have no idea how he would have known. But they knew now that they had to go with the pink one. I was very happy that I shared that message with them, and that they handled it well, but for being so early in my career, it was a pretty powerful moment for me. Obviously, I never found out what she did end up doing or how it all turned out, but I'm sure Roger was still with them in spirit, celebrating. I've had some crazy stories since I've been a nurse so long and worked in so many different places. I may share more of them eventually, if you or your audience are interested. I know that this wasn't exactly spooky, but I still thought it was pretty bizarre. So, I thought that you all would still enjoy it as much as I did. In August of 1987, I was expecting my second child. My grandmother was in the hospital dying from internal bleeding from a fall that she had from falling out of her wheelchair. My mother had gone to visit my grandmother in the hospital. While they were talking, my grandmother said, Get me off of this ship." My mother reminded my grandmother, her mother, that she was in the hospital. My grandmother insisted that she was on a ship. My mother asked her, "Who's on this ship with you?" Because my mom was a big believer in all things supernatural. She thought that she could get more information. My grandmother replied, "You know that guy who does the stories about the mob? Ned Day from the news? And my nurse. The one that comes during the night shift." My mom asked where the ship was going, and my grandmother said, "The cemetery." Obviously, my mom was a bit worried at that point, being a big believer. She knew the time was close for my grandma to pass away. The next day, I went to visit my grandmother in the hospital. I was 5 months pregnant and wasn't feeling that great. When I arrived, my grandma asked me to come close because she wanted to touch my belly. As she placed her hand on my belly, she told me, "It's a girl, you know." I said, "No, Grandma, I don't know. Because tomorrow they're going to do an ultrasound to see if they can see. And they'll tell me if it's a boy or a girl." My grandmother assured me that it was in fact a girl, and I told her that I would let her know once I found out. She said, "It's okay. I know it's a girl." I just smiled and said, "Okay, Grandma." Later that evening, my mother went to see Grandma, and my grandma told my mom, "Do you see her?" My mom asked her, "See who?" My grandmother said, "It's my mom. She's sitting in the corner, and she came to get me." My mom looked over, but she saw nobody, but asked her mother to describe the woman. My grandmother described her mother exactly, and told my mom that she was waiting for her. After my mom left the hospital, she came home and was telling us all about what Grandma had said, and I told her what Grandma said to me about my baby. A few hours later, the hospital called my mom to say that Grandma had passed away. We were all devastated, but what's even stranger is that just a few days later, we heard that the newscaster, Ned Day, had also died. We were blown away. When my mom went back to the hospital to invite my grandmother's nurse to her funeral, my mother was informed that the nurse had tragically died in a car accident just that morning. Oh, and I got that ultrasound, and my baby was indeed a girl. So, that's it. I've been a true believer ever since. Grandma was right. Thanks for reading this, Raven. I love your podcast, and keep doing it. I will, and thank you for sending the story in. So, I used to be a nurse at what one could consider a fairly dated hospital. It was in a rather small town in the Midwest, and it wasn't very well equipped. Even back then, it was dated. Because of its size, there was a ton of gossip and stories that were passed back and forth between the nurses and doctors. And more often than not, at least one person would have a story about some weird paranormal experience they had had at the hospital. A disembodied voice, a phantom touch, those kind of silly things. Things you might expect in a building where things either get better or come to an end for those that visit. I was always a practical person in my approach to the work. Sure, ghosts may exist, but I was more of an ignore it and let's get this done kind of person. And, as it happens to many, many people, I had an experience where that wasn't quite an option. It was a fairly quiet shift, which, when working as a nurse on the night shift, is an absolute blessing. It can also be a curse, because the moment you make that comment, something inevitably happens. We were fairly short-staffed, as always, so I was making rounds through the parts of the facility that were temporarily closed. This may sound silly, but we had to make sure the wing was secure. It may be a quiet town, sure, but there were still rowdy teenagers in town, and we'd had a few break-ins before. Basically, all I had to do was make sure the windows were closed and locked, and make sure that the construction crew hadn't left anything behind from their day work doing the renovations. I went room by room, made my checks, and found nothing out of the ordinary. Until I got to the last room, of course. I opened the door, and was immediately hit with a cold breeze. I thought that maybe the window was open, but when I checked, it was completely secured and shut. While I was checking the window, the door behind me made a creaking sound, and as soon as I turned to look, it slammed shut. I nearly jumped out of my skin when it happened. Definitely not a normal thing, as the doors in this wing had to be pulled shut, like with a slight bit of force. I started to walk toward the door, and after the second step, I felt something grab my ankle, and I tripped, landing face first on the tile. It's important to state that whatever it was that wrapped around my ankle, it felt like it was frozen. It was like an icy hand had reached out of nowhere and twisted its fingers around my leg, causing me to fall. After I fell, I quickly turned to look at what it was that I tripped over. But there was nothing there. Like at all. This room was prepped for renovations, but hadn't been touched. The equipment had mostly been moved out, minus a few things being stored, but everything was back against the wall. There was nothing in the middle of the room to block my path. Then, it got slightly creepier. As I pulled myself up, I noticed what looked like a small piece of notebook paper sitting on the floor near me. I picked it up and unfolded it, and I honestly wish that I hadn't. There was a note that looked like it was written by someone that was struggling to hold the pen, and it said, "I want out. I'm so cold. I'm so lonely." A shiver ran straight down my spine. I pocketed that note and immediately jumped up and ran out of the room, and then speed walked down the hallway, considering my rounds done. Now, obviously, it's possible that this note was left as a joke by a construction worker or another night nurse or something like that. But finding it alongside the chill and being grabbed by nothing was enough for me to be done with it all. Joke or not, it was creepy as hell. And that's kind of it. I know it's a short story, but it scared the hell out of me, and I wanted to share it. The closest thing I experienced after that, before I left, was a lot of creepy whispering. Like voices in the hallway when there was no one around. It was scary, sure, but I can handle that way better than I could handle being grabbed or finding freaky notes like that. My mom has worked at a small rural hospital for about 6 years now. She's the ER receptionist, so she is the first person you see when you come into the emergency room, the one to give you all the paperwork to fill out and such. Throughout these 6 years, she worked mostly nights, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and has seen quite the cast of characters the town has to offer. Every transient, druggie, and local has passed through that lobby, and she has seen each one at least twice. But one night, she encountered something she had never seen before or again since. Back in the first year, my mom was quick to get the hang of things, so she was left alone to work the counter. The ER faced the parking lot so she could see people coming in from far away and anticipate their moves. One night, at about 2 a.m., she was working on her computer, looked up, and was surprised to see 2 people standing there. A man and a woman just standing there, staring at her. And she stared back. The parking lot was dark, no car in sight, and they just appeared. After a long moment, they came into the lobby and went right up to the desk. My mom said the alarm bells started going off in her head that something wasn't right. For one thing, they were very tall. The desk my mom sat at would come up to mid-chest on an average person. With these people, my mom could see the pelvic bone of the woman. They were dressed for hot weather because it was summer. They were also very skinny and, my mom emphasized this, very dry looking. But they didn't look like your typical druggies. The woman kept stroking her neck with long fingers, saying she had a sore throat. My mom, for the first and only time, didn't say a word. She just looked at them. A word kept repeating in her head. Strigwe. As my mom looked at them, the woman looked to the man, looked back at my mom, and then to the man again. The whole time just smiling and stroking her throat, and said to the man, "Do you think she'll let us through? Or should we go somewhere else?" My mom stayed silent as the woman repeated the pattern of looks, and then they both smiled at my mom and left. Almost after, my mom texted me, asking if vampires needed permission to enter places like hospitals. I told her since she was technically the person to say who went back to the ER, they would need her permission. We both knew that Strigwe was a type of Romanian vampire mythos, and that was the word she kept hearing in her mind. She has never seen that couple again, and we still talk about what happened. It does make me wonder when I hear about stories of black-eyed children and other tales of vampires. What did she see that night? And how close was she to something unreal? I told my GP that I had an odd experience while coming out of anesthesia. He asked if I met God. Well, no, not God. But let me start at the beginning. Apparently the first thing I said after the surgery was that if anything went wrong, my return address is on my back. I don't remember that, but in point of fact, my return address is on my back. It says, property of the William M. Bass Donated Skeletal Collection. My own memories are a bit scrambled. I knew where I was, I could hear the sounds of the recovery area, but that's not what I was seeing. I was wandering among gigantic carved stone monoliths of deities from various religions, ages, and locales. They were aware of me, but mostly I was beneath their notice. To complicate matters, I was not wearing my glasses. Now, I'm not blind. Yet. Again. I will undoubtedly reach -8 diopters again, eventually. But in this instance, my brain decided that I never had eye surgery, and that my vision was still around -12. Maybe worse. I had to get really close to the statues to make out details clear enough to recognize who was who before I moved on. Which is why I was within arm's reach before I realized what I was seeing on one. It was a skirt of rattlesnakes, and a necklace of hearts and severed human hands. Mind you, I respect Kotliku, but it occurred to me that the Aztec goddess of the womb in the tomb might not be a felicitous entity to encounter while recovering from heart surgery. I was trying to apologize respectfully while backing away when I finally woke up. So that, my friends, was a collection of some scary hospital stories. A lot of these were more paranormal than I anticipated. Most of these were submitted, actually. One of them was from Reddit, but most of these were submitted directly to me. I like to believe that's a result of me asking for these kinds of stories, so thank you to those who took the time, of course. And thank you to the person from Reddit that let me read their story. And thank you to you for listening to me. Appreciate it. Goodbye. No. Seriously, thank you for listening, as I cannot overstate how much I appreciate that. Without y'all listening to me, I wouldn't have a successful channel, right? Without y'all listening, I would just be speaking into the void as it is. I'd be narrating into a microphone for the YouTube robots to listen. Would be pleasing for the robots, though. And we gotta please the robots. Because they're coming. No, Lord, they coming. Anyways, hopefully you all enjoyed these hospital stories. Again, thank you to everyone who submitted their story or let me use their story. If you did enjoy the stories, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel and haven't already, please consider subscribing, as that helps tremendously. It also helps my ego feel better and tells me that I'm doing the right thing, and that I should keep going, so there's that. If you're feeling ever so bold, you can also go below the video and leave me a comment. I just popped my back, sorry. Leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts, how you're doing, how your day is going, what you had for lunch, what you're having for dinner, what your plans are this weekend, whatever you want to. It's up to you. I will try to reply, and we'll have a short back-and-forth conversation. Yeah. You can also join Patreon or memberships for early access to content like this. Never expected, always appreciated. As well as the super thanks, which is just a tip to the channel. Just a way of saying thank you. Donation, if you will. However you want to look at it. All that said, friends, hopefully you're having a beautiful day and a beautiful week so far. Hope you have a great weekend. Hope I do see you again here very soon, like tomorrow. But until then, remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You are the best you that you can be. Don't forget it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And until next time, my friends, much love. And of course, sleep well.